Hi, my name is Dr. Ruchi Watson, and I'm the Managing Director of the Goff Strategic Leadership Center here at the University of Utah. Today, I'm going to talk to you a bit about case competitions. Now, you might be in a situation where you're thinking about doing a case competition, or you've signed up for one but don't really know what to expect, or you could be in it right now going, I need a little bit of help. Regardless, today I'm going to talk a little bit about what a case is and spend some time going through a bit of a framework for how you can approach it. Some tips and tricks and tools you can use as you successfully navigate a case competition. So first of all, what exactly is a case? Now that word may not be familiar to you. You might be thinking about a case like in law school or a briefcase, luggage. When we talk about a case, essentially what that is a small version of a real world experience. So you could think of it almost as a mini internship. It's an opportunity to work on a real world issue or challenge. A company or an industry, someone has come to you saying, here's a situation, we have a problem, and we need your smart, innovative brain on it. Help us. Now, the nuance is versus an internship or something is that it's typically a shorter time frame. So some cases are 24 hours, hackathon, very quick. Some can be a few weeks long. So we don't always have a whole lot of time to spend working on it, but that's also kind of the beauty of it. The other top opportunity that a case brings us is to really apply what we learned in our classes. So no matter what your major is, you have learned some content that could be helpful, some background context, or even things like time management, working with the team. How do you start something, finish something, communicate? All of those things are really valuable when you're working on a case, and we'll talk about those. As I mentioned, teams, most cases have you working with other people in order to accomplish the case, provide a proposal or recommendation. And that's always a great opportunity. We all know as we're going to go out in the workforce that we're going to work with other people, and oftentimes people that aren't just like us. So case competition is a great way to practice working with others. And if you get to create your own team, I would invite you to consider having a diverse team. Think about folks from different backgrounds who might think about things a bit differently, because it's that creativity that's actually really valuable when you're working on a case. It's also just a great learning experience. As you can imagine, working on something that's a real challenge for our company or an industry is really valuable, something that they really need some help with. And if you spend some time working on this difficult problem, putting yourself out there, out of your comfort zone, you're going to learn a lot from the process. And to put it bluntly, it can be a great resume builder. I know there's always a little bit of that trick of you're trying to get an internship or a job, but when you go to the interview, they want to talk about your experiences. Tell me a time when. But if you're trying to get your first job or internship, then you don't have that experience. So a case is a perfect way to go beyond what you're doing in a class and say, here you go, I've actually worked on something real with a team. Here's what I did, how I did it. You also might have your own goals that you're seeking after, personally, professionally. So a case could be a great way to practice something that you personally would like to get out of an experience. That could be something as simple as, I'm really not great with public speaking and I'd like to practice presenting. Because a case is typically not part of a class, so you don't have to worry about a grade, and it's not part of a job or internship, so you don't have to worry about, your salary or whether you're going to get a full-time position. It's a pretty low risk way to get some really awesome experience. So let's talk about how in the world do you tackle a case. So here I've listed a framework. And the reason why I say a framework or a structure, that's another word for how you might think of framework, is that there are many ways that you could tackle a case, but there are some common elements. And this is one visual that I really like to show you what is important. If you look at the things in black, those are the things that you're probably familiar with, or you might think that would be important as you're working on a case. So there's some sort of problem that you're given, and then you have to define the project. And notice that I've kind of differentiated between those terms, problem and project. And here's why. They are not the same. So if you think about something big like climate change, that's a big problem in many people's eyes. But that's not something very specific that you could go and work on. So defining the project, you might say, I'm going to tackle climate change by looking at air pollution or water pollution or something to do with animals. So getting more specific about what you're going to focus on, that's what we mean in defining the project. Then You want to structure that. So what specifically are you going to do? You might say we're going to look at air pollution. Well, that's still pretty big. What does that mean? How are you going to structure it? How are you going to get to actual actions and activities that you could do in conducting analyses, which is the next part of the framework? Once you've done some analysis, you might have some data, interviews, more information. What do you do with that? Typically in a case competition, you're presenting a proposal or a set of recommendations back to judges or whoever is looking at the competition. You can't just present a bunch of data. You have to put some meaning to it. So synthesizing those things into insights and recommendations is really important. And the real reason why I like this framework is those things in black are very important, but then they wrap around it those things in red and gray: relationships and communications. Relationships are important because when you're working on something, and this is a little bit more when you're in the workplace or a job or internship, you could have the best analysis, but let's say people don't trust you or they're not really willing to listen to what you have to say. Well, then the best analysis in the world doesn't matter. Similarly, if you have great analysis, but the way you communicate those proposals or recommendations isn't really in a way that the audience can hear it, then that analysis doesn't matter. So all of those things are important. And if you look at the bottom there, problem finding and problem solving, we often talk or hear about problem solving. Everyone wants great problem solvers, right? But I would argue that being a great problem finder is really important. And we'll talk about that more in a second. And as you learn things and you're getting information and insights, you might find that your problem and the project that you're working on shifts a little bit. How you're solving it shifts a little bit. So it's not something that just happens at the beginning. It happens throughout the process. So I'm going to use this framework to talk through how you can be successful in a case competition. So one of the questions that folks always ask as they're embarking on a case competition is, where in the world do I start? So let's take a look at our framework. We've been given a problem. Now we need to define the project. How do we do that? Before we get there, I just want to say how critically important this is. And you can read the quote on the screen. Very common, again, for all of us have learned to be great problem solvers to want to jump right in. It's human nature to want to solve a problem that we're given. But it's really, really, really important that we don't jump into solving a problem only to find out later we solved the wrong problem. There's another quote that I really love by Einstein where it says something to the effect of, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes identifying what the problem was and then 5 minutes actually solving it. So this just underscores how critically important it is to step back and really define what it is that you're doing in this case competition. And here are some things to think about with you and the team as you're doing that. First, establish a need. If this is worth spending your time, the organization's time, the case competition's time on, there's got to be a reason. There's got to be a deeper need. Make sure you understand what that is. Because if you're going to present proposals and recommendations back, it better serve a real need. And you better understand what the outcome is that they're trying to achieve. You might think that an outcome A is really important, but if the organization is really trying to achieve B, then make sure that your recommendations are leaning towards B. That doesn't mean that you can't say, hey, you might consider A, but make sure you really understand what you're trying to achieve. In that second column, oftentimes there's a lot of existing information and context that's going to be valuable to you. So let's say the organization is trying to achieve something. What if they already tried? Maybe they've already put some time and energy into this and they just haven't been successful. Well, you don't want to go ahead and propose the very same things that they've already tried. So it's helpful to know what the context is. Also, this is one of my favorite things that my teams often tease me about is, what have others done? More often than not, there's someone else who's tackled the very same problem. How have they done it? What are the various ways it can be done? It's not that you can just take their solution and plop it into this situation, but you can oftentimes learn a lot. That's called benchmarking. And also, what constraints does the organization or the case have? You might come up with a great solution that costs $1 million a year, only to find out that the constraints are that they can't afford to do anything over $5,000 a year. So build that into how you're defining what you're doing. And then ultimately write it down. Write a statement that establishes exactly what you're doing. What are the things that you're tackling? What are those constraints? What are any specific deliverables? Are you supposed to come up with a business plan with financials or a marketing strategy? Be really clear what that is and write it down so you know what success looks like. Okay, once you've defined the project, then you can go ahead and say, let's start that problem solving piece of what you're going to do. Structure it and move forward. Create a plan. Now, even after the project definition, you've done a lot of work, you've defined it, it can still be pretty big. So here's an example. You might find that a problem is that an organization's profitability is declining. Okay, clear problem. And you've done your work, you've done your homework, and your project is you're going to define it as identifying one new product line for this company that could launch by 2022. So there's one constraint, and deliver $1 million of profit by 2025. There's another sort of constraint or output that you want to achieve. But where do you start? That's still pretty big. So you want to structure within that. Now, you may have come across a profitability structure if you're in the business school or have sort of seen a framework like this before, or you might Google one and find out. Sometimes it takes a little bit of research to figure out how to structure, but one way is that there might be a standard one like this. Profitability is often broken down into price and revenues and costs, and then you can break down revenues into price and quantity. And most of us are consumers. We understand what price means and quantity means. Then you can start asking yourself some pretty interesting questions about price. That's something that we understand pretty well versus identifying one new product line, which still feels really big. But there isn't always a standard structure that will work for everyone. So I'm going to talk to you about a tool that you can use to create your own structure. There are two ways that you can do this. An issue tree is one, and a hypothesis tree is another. And we could spend hours and hours in talking about these. So I'm just going to highlight one in case it's valuable for you. And typically the easier one to think about is the issue tree. So how would you start? Broken record by identifying the problem and then the project. What is it that you're trying to do? And oftentimes people, depending on how they work on a team, and again, a lot of diversity in teams, so we all think a little differently, which is great, is you start thinking about questions like, oh gosh, define a new product line. What could that be? What are they already doing? How much, money? Where would we sell it? Who's going to buy it? There's all kinds of questions that might come up. My advice to you is to find through a Google Doc, a Google Excel, something, write all those questions down, because having that diverse team, you're all going to come at it with a different lens. Capture them all somewhere, because those questions come to you at different points in time, and you might not be during your team meeting when you're all sitting nicely together. But then what an issue tree does is it helps you organize those questions from really big picture questions to really detailed questions. So there are high-level questions and then sub-questions. What you don't want to do is to feel like you're completely what they call boiling the ocean, where you have so many questions that it looks like this. But, because that's a little yikes, but you do want to structure your questions in a way that you start getting to something where you know how to answer the questions and you know how to move forward, because you're like, I see. If I just did a survey or did some research or talks to X person, that's how I could answer those questions. And then it feels more comfortable because you know how to move forward in your case. But let me show you an example to make this a little bit clearer. So here's just a silly example. Let's say, here at the David Eccles School of Business, we've had a dunk tank before. So let's say the problem is that we're having some trouble finding faculty members to be in the dunk tank. So my class has decided they're going to influence me, and they don't know how the best way is to influence me to do that. But they've done some initial digging somehow, maybe talked to some former classes, and they hear that maybe candy or chocolate is the way to go. And the trouble is they don't really know the best way. Maybe it's candy, maybe it's not. And if it is candy, there's so many types. So, what kind of candy could it be? So they want to know how they could influence me. Here's what an issue tree might look like. Again, pretty basic. What should the class do to influence? That's what they're trying to answer. That's the highest level question. And then they kind of break it out into what influences most. Like I said, that might be candy, it might be other things. But then also, what can the class execute? Now let's talk about why that's important. Let's say the most influential thing for me is diamonds. Obviously, the class is not going to buy diamonds. That may be a constraint that we need to consider in the overall definition up front. And so it's important to ask those different types of questions. But before you drill into candy, let's make sure that you think about what influences me most and then think about candy. So that's you can kind of see the levels or the layers of the questions that one could have in an issue tree. Now, here's where issue trees get really fun. These questions, if you think about it, the things in the bullets are things you could do to answer the questions. They're really more common sense. In your team, once you get the right questions, you can sit down together and brainstorm what are some ways you can answer those questions. And once you've done that, poof, now you've figured out the set of activities you could do to answer your case or to get a set answer to get to your proposals and recommendations. So let's look at this. So for example, under what influences me most? Interview Ruchi's husband. Great. What you can do is take what's involved in an interview, reaching out to him, setting up the time, coming up with the questions, writing down what was said, coming up with the insights from what was said. There are all these little steps that go into any one of these activities. So once you decide what you want to do, then you can do what's called a work plan, which is basically just putting pen to paper to say who's going to do what and when are they going to do it. Because obviously you want to schedule the interview before you try to analyze the insights for the interview, right? So that's how a tree can help you get from your project definition all the way to planning the work you're going to do for the case competition. Now, remember, even something like interviewing my husband, you want to be really clear on the definition. There's so many things that you could ask and probably a limited amount of time to do it. So even your tasks need to be defined, because the worst thing you could do is you go off, do what you think you're supposed to do. You come back to the team and then realize, oh no, we don't have time. Or I didn't do the right thing. And as I mentioned, case competitions often have a limited time. So if you've gone off and spent a couple days on something that wasn't really ultimately valuable to what you're trying to accomplish as a team, that's just the worst. So make sure you define every task that every team member has. And if you're not sure, ask. Go to your team and say, here's what I think I'm supposed to be doing, and here's what I'm going to come back with. Does that sound right? It's just a nice way to make sure everyone's on the same page. And again, writing it down, even better. Because we've all been in that situation where you're in a meeting and you're all hearing the same things. Maybe you're in a class, whatever it is, and you walk away. And then you come back and realize, oh, we all heard that a little bit differently. So writing it down will help to ensure that you're all on the same page. Okay, final little note on trees, just to add a little extra learning to today. There is a term that you may have heard called Misi. That's M-E-C-E. Mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive. That's what that stands for, M-E-C-E, Misi. And what that means is when you're writing down all your questions for your issue tree, you want to make sure it covers all possible content. But you also want to make sure that there's not overlap between things that are in the same layer. And here's a very simple example for what I mean. Let's say your topic is sporting equipment. You've got rackets and balls. Okay, well, rackets and balls don't overlap. Those are clearly different things. But if we just stopped there, does that really cover off everything in sporting equipment land? No, clearly not, because there are helmets and shoes and pads and nets, right? So there are lots of other things. So if you stopped there, you wouldn't be what's called collectively exhaustive. You wouldn't exhaust all the options under sporting equipment. Now, if you said rackets and then tennis rackets all in the same level, well, now there's some overlap because clearly a tennis racket is a type of racket. So that's not being mutually exclusive. So as you're thinking about your questions and how you might create your trees, try to keep things Misi, all on the same level. Okay, let's move on. You've structured, you've figured out what you need to do. You're starting to get to the point of how do we answer those questions that are in our tree? That all comes down to analysis, and there are many different ways that you can do research. And this is where I think things get really fun. There's something called desk research, perhaps. It could be at a desk, on your bed, with your laptop, on your phone, whatever it is. But this is, to me, one of the first places to start. It could be, emails, Googling, Wikipedia. Yes, I said Google and Wikipedia. great places to start, because oftentimes with a case competition, you may have no prior knowledge to what the topic is, and that's okay. Actually, I think that's where the growth happens the most. And again, can be really fun to learn about an entirely new topic. So how do we get up to speed quickly and learn something new? I honestly think Wikipedia and Google are great ways. Now, caveat, you knew that was coming, is that you want to make sure that you find other sources that might be a little more credible. If there's any data or really key piece of information you see in a quick Google search, or Wikipedia, because maybe something that you're looking for is in a blog, you might want to go ahead and find the original source of the information before you present anything back in your proposals for a case competition. Those things are great ways to get some general knowledge, but then when you go deeper, and we'll talk about that in a second, you want to get some more credible sources. But I also put email in this bucket, because let's say you're looking at that climate change sort of problem, and you have a cousin that works for the Environmental Protection Agency. Well, heck, that might be a great person to reach out to and just say, hey, I'm doing this great thing called a case competition. Can you help me out? Do you know anything about X? Because again, case competitions are time bound. You don't have a ton of time. So if you can get some quick information from someone you know, shooting off an email, that's a great way to just get some basic knowledge. Now, after you've got the basics, then we can go a little deeper. This says literature review, which is kind of the academic's way of saying get some more really credible information. Now, you may have no idea where to start to say, well, what's a credible source of information? We all know there's a ton of stuff out there on websites, but it doesn't mean that it's true. So my quick tip for you is, especially if you're a university student, is to go to the library. That's what librarians are for, and they do such a great job. There are, if you're at the University of Utah, the Marriott Library has so much more information and so many databases that you would not believe it. Even I don't know the extent of all the databases they have, and they can help you navigate that. Again, a really smart way to leverage your time. Go to the experts. But you do need to do that basic information first, because you're not going to know the right questions to ask of the librarian if you don't understand the basics. So start with that and then go to more detailed searches. And if you're a little familiar with academic literature, if you feel like academic publications might be a good place for you, then you might check out something like Google Scholar. But again, if that's all new language to you, just start with folks at the library. That's going to be your best bet. Interviews. Oh, that might be my favorite source of information. As you might tell, I love talking to people, and interviews are a great way to get information when you've, again, already exhausted kind of the first two, where you can do your research from books, from other sources where you can read, because oftentimes you only get one shot at interviewing somebody, and you might only get 15 or 20 minutes with them. So you want to make sure that you're asking the most valuable questions that you can in those interviews, and not asking something that you could have answered in a different way via a different source. But interviews, as it says here, are an art form. I think that sometimes we take them a little too lightly. Oh, I'll just get on the phone with someone and ask questions. But like I said, it's a waste of that resource if you're not asking the most valuable questions. So as with many things throughout this presentation, I would make sure you define what you're trying to get out of that interview. Write it down. Write down your questions, write down their answers, record it if they're comfortable with that, because then you can always refer back to it. But interviews are a great way to get information quickly, especially, I think, on a case competition, but really in anything that you do. Surveys are another great way. So you might be familiar with surveys online. I think many of us have done them, polls, Qualtrics surveys. And if you're at the University of Utah, you probably have access to Qualtrics, so you could do surveys. But broken record here, define what it is that you want to do. Write down those questions, iterate on those questions, work with your team before you submit a survey out to the world. Because here's one common challenge. If you don't really think about it that closely, you just want to get the questions written down, and you know well enough what you're asking for. You put the survey out there, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, you didn't really ask that question well, or you missed out on a response that you really should have put out there, or you should have asked for comments because now you don't really understand the responses that you're getting. That's the worst. So make sure you understand what it is that you want to ask in the survey. Maybe even do a little quick pilot Send it to a few people. Say, do these questions make sense? What were you thinking when you answered them? Look at what their responses look like. And if it's like, uh-oh, that's not really getting us what we need, then you still have time to tweak it before you send the survey out. The second thing I see people do with surveys is, it's easy to send surveys out to our own networks and people that we know. But let's say you're doing a project where you really need to get to senior citizens, people looking to retire, something like that. And your network is on your own social media, which let's say is typically in your own age range, which might not be the same. Don't get caught in the trap where you just send a survey out to the people who are easy. Make sure you send it out to the target audience and the people that you need to get information from. Otherwise, that information is not going to be very valuable. And the last thing you want is to be in your case competition proposal presenting, and you say, oh, this is what we learned from our survey. We learned so much. And they say, oh, who did you talk to? And you say, oh, well, our friends, people in the dorm. And they say, well, we're really trying to talk to seniors. Is that relevant? And chances are it won't be. So think hard about how you implement each of these things and make sure you make time in your plan and in your case competition timeline to actually do them well. Okay, so you've got a lot of great information. You've Googled, you've interviewed, you've surveyed, you've got it. Now what? As I mentioned, you can have great information, but you need to package it together in a way that's going to communicate what you want to communicate really effectively. So one way to do that is to tell a story. And really what you're doing in a case competition especially is you're putting together a proposal or a recommendation that you hope is kind of better than the other team's proposal and recommendation, right? Typically there's some sort of reward or prize, or there's first, second, third place. And if you're doing case competition, absolutely in addition to just learning and having a great experience, which will be great for anybody that enters, but let's just assume you kind of want to win. So you're trying to persuade the judges that your proposal is better than everyone else's. So while sales tends to have a bad rap for car salesmanship, really it's just persuasive communication. Think about it that way. And telling a story is a great way to do that. And telling stories, there's so much literature on this, so we won't have time to talk about it all, but really it's something that when we talk about the head and the heart, stories can really touch the heart. And think about it, those are the ones that really stick with you, right? So if you can tell a story in your case competition, think about when we talked about definition, that there is a need. There has to be a real need. Tie your proposal and your recommendation story back to that need, back to something that really matters. Is there an impact on the world? Is there an impact on an individual? Use that to really hook people. Now, you may have heard when you're doing a communication to tell them what you're going to tell them the story, and then at the end, tell them again. I completely agree with that. But I think sometimes that can be confusing because it sounds like you tell people the same thing 3 times. Here's a little nuance to that. I think about it a little bit like a movie. Tell them at first, like the movie trailer, give them a little teaser. Here's what it's going to be, but not everything. Then the movie is your presentation, you actually telling them, what the story is. And stories tend to have some plot and characters, and then something shocking that happens, and then some sort of resolution. And then think about the end is sort of that summary, like that little Cliff's Notes version of, okay, you watched the movie, now here's the thing that I want to leave you with. So hopefully that gives you a sense of how you might structure that communication. Okay, now when you're actually doing it, how should you do it? Here's some tips and tricks, and there's a lot of information on the slide, but essentially what it comes down to is leverage your time wisely. One of the most common mistakes that I have seen in students is, one, they don't touch the presentation until right at the end, right before it's due, right before they have to submit something. And that crunch time makes it really difficult to do a good job on your communication. 2, the other mistake I see people make is they jump right into the PowerPoint, the Prezi, the whatever fancy system that they're working in, and they make it all beautiful before they really know what they're trying to communicate. And that's just a waste of resources, because oftentimes if you make something beautiful, then you find out, oh, we do actually need to make some tweaks, and it just takes so much time. So here's my recommendation. Start with an outline, whether it's Google Docs, Word document, that's something your team can easily iterate on too. It's something that you could create while you're doing your analysis. People can kind of go in and say, here's what I'm learning. Here are the insights. And who cares if you need to order things around? That's pretty easy to do when you're working in an outline format with bullet points. Once you feel really good about your outline, then you can start thinking about what are the visuals that will convey the messages that you have on your outline. So we all know that visuals are much, much more engaging than bullet points, though I'm sure all seen our fair share of presentations that are just all bullets all the time. There may be a time and place for that. But when you're trying to tell a story and be persuasive, I would argue if you really think about it and push yourself, there's a visual that can help you convey your information. And it's not just if there's quantitative data, charts and bar charts and pie charts. Sure, those might be a little bit more obvious. But if you think about it, there's great ways to convey qualitative data too. And if you Google on that, you can find some great visuals as well. But again, I would argue instead of going into the PowerPoint or whatever mechanism you're using, draw it out. Draw it out first. So then if you don't like it, you're not wasting time. It's pretty fast to draw things. Then once you feel really good, put it in there. Put it in the PowerPoint or whatever you're using. Then you've got the charts. And something that's really cool is if you're doing something like a survey, you might want to actually go to this point of drawing out what is it that we want to get back from that survey? What would we want the chart to look like that aligns with question number 5 in the survey? Then once you know what the visual is, it actually helps you to write those questions better so that you know what the answers you're going to get are going to help you to populate that chart or visual or whatever you're looking for in your presentation. And finally, once you feel really good about that, put the data in and you've got your draft of your communication. Now notice I say draft and then final. It's really, really important to also bake in time to iterate. That means getting feedback from people and not just putting everything in there and hitting submit. Even though case competitions are time bound, make sure you have time to show your presentation to others, which can feel a little vulnerable, right? They could give you feedback, tell you this doesn't look right, that number's wrong, it doesn't make sense to me, I don't get what you're saying. But wouldn't you rather hear that from peers, mentors, coaches, others that you can go to than to hear that from the judges? Feedback is really such a gift, and most people are really keen on doing it kindly. So one thing you might think about early on in your time working on the case is who are the people that you could call upon to give you some feedback. It could be some of the experts that you identify along the way, or it could just be peers or friends. You might want to line them up and say, hey, a couple of days before this thing is due, would you mind taking a look so that we have time to edit and iterate? Okay, those are my tips. I know it's been a lot. So let me kind of come back around to what are some key things I want to make sure that you learn about this whole process of doing a case competition. I worked with a lot of students in various ways in doing them, and here are some things that constantly come up. One thing that we didn't talk about with project definition is something called scope. That's kind of how big your project is. Like how much stuff do you have going on with it? And again, if you've got a 24-hour case versus a 3-week case, that scope probably should look a little different. But if it feels like it's too big, like you get to the point where you've done your definition in your tree and you're getting to the point of your work plan, thinking there's no way we can do all of this, then you probably need to tighten that scope a little. And that's okay. In fact, it's good because you don't want to commit to doing more than what you can actually do. Tighten that scope, do something that's more focused. Instead of doing 3 things, do 1, but do it really well. Okay, the next thing is to revisit your definition in your trees. And I think I kind of alluded to this earlier. Sometimes you start doing your analysis, you're doing research, you've talked to the librarian, they've given you 10 amazing ideas for things you can do. And all of a sudden you're so excited and you realize you're up to your elbows in something that actually doesn't relate to the project as you've defined it. So make sure you go back and continuously think, how is this going to help us be successful with our project and how we've defined it, with the constraints that the organization has, with all the things we talked about with project definition. Multiple sources of information, we talked about that. Just make sure, sometimes we look at a source, we get excited about a number or an insight. And it's always good to have, 2 or 3 that can kind of corroborate what you're about to present to someone. And then again, remember to convey what's compelling and not just interesting. You might do all that research and go, oh my goodness, this is such an interesting topic. I found so many things. But then when you tie it back to your project definition and how you scoped it, you're going to find that some things need to get to the cutting room floor, or they're just not really compelling to the story you're trying to tell. And the most difficult part of this is sometimes you've worked really hard or a lot of hours on something that just doesn't end up being compelling to the story your team wants to tell. But just know that by you working really hard, that's how you identified whether it was important or not. But just because you worked hard on it doesn't mean that it belongs in that final presentation or proposal. Finally, I mentioned this, so I'll say it again, make sure you have time for the communication piece. You don't want to do all this hard, amazing work only to find out that you didn't convey it in the case competition to the judges as well as you really wanted to. And you're probably seeing that while I'm talking about this in context of a case competition, these are all really great lessons for a job, for an internship. So it may not be judges, maybe it's your boss. So take these learnings and apply them to other places that might be relevant for you. Now let's get really specific. Again, you may be in different places in your life cycle with the case competition, but if you have the opportunity as a part of your case competition or by identifying experts to ask some questions along the way, here's how I would recommend you start before you ask those questions. Right off the bat, you typically be given a prompt for the case, like here's what the case is, here's the information we have. I would suggest that each individual on the team read it first by themselves without the team there. Because if you come together and only one person's read it, it's a little too easy to go to that group think to where everyone's just like, sure, whatever that person says. So force yourself individually to read it. And I would suggest that each of you write down what you think the project definition should be based on the prompt, maybe some basic Googling and Wikipediaing first. Everyone get a little bit smart about the case before you come together. Then when you come together, you can agree upon what that definition looks like, how you're going to scope it, and brainstorm a tree together so that you can start getting to the point of what those bullets were and can create a work plan. When you do create a work plan for whatever time you have for the case competition, make sure you build in some little wiggle room. We all know things come up. Oh no, I had a midterm. Something came up personally. If you've got everything so tightly scheduled to the point of submitting your case, it's Murphy's Law. Something is bound to go wrong. So make sure you build in some time and help each other out. There are oftentimes going to be something comes up. That doesn't mean that just because I was assigned something in the work plan and I get busy that now it can't happen. Be communicative and talk to each other. Maybe somebody else can cover for you. Okay, now what are some logistics? I think that, every team, whether it's on a case competition, in a course, at your job, it's really important to just talk to each other and set expectations. So you can do that formally and create a team charter for yourselves. Talk about how you best communicate, when you best communicate. What are your expectations for this case? Are you expecting to work all day and all night, whatever it takes? Are you kind of like, I'm interested in this, but I only have about 4 hours a week to dedicate? Whatever that looks like for you and your team, just put it out there, talk about it up front so that there are no surprises down the line. It's also great to just talk about your strengths. That way, if you need to lean on somebody, oh, hey, that person is a finance major and has worked a ton in building financial models. So if we ever need to do that, they'd be a great person to lean on, or they might have great resources in their faculty and otherwise. Also, think about what you're trying to learn. When we talked about a case, we talked about it being a great learning experience. If there's something that you want to try or do, right up front is a great time to say to your team, I'd really love to practice presenting if we get an opportunity to do that, but it's not my strength. Could you all help me with that? 9 times out of 10, people are really happy to do that. Also, logistically, set some meeting times. I would do this early on. Some cases that we do, they are actually months long, and it might feel like, oh, we've got time to do it, but I would argue at least weekly for months long cases, or if it's only a 3-week case, you might need to meet 2 or 3 times a week just to make sure that you have enough time with your team to do all this work that you need to do, to touch base, to discuss the analysis and insights with one another. If it's a 24-hour case, What's that going to look like for everybody? Is everybody willing to commit that time that they need to commit to do a good job? And finally, think through, what's going to really facilitate a good meeting for you? What are the expectations there? Are you expecting everyone to come with their idea, having read what they need to read, thought about it, and come just to discuss? Then you better say that up front. Do you need Zoom? Do you need a Jamboard, Google Slides? Do you need certain tools to make sure that you can work together? If you're going to brainstorm hypothesis tree on Zoom, is someone going to be able to share their screen and draw real time? What does that look like? Don't wait until you're in the meeting to think about, oh, shoot, how's this going to work? Because you'll spend majority of the meeting just figuring out the logistics, and no one has time for that. Similarly, how are you going to share information? With all the technology and tools we have today, it could be Google, Ubox, whatever, just decide and make sure everyone's on the same page. So that way, if someone does get busy or something comes up, someone gets sick, you can always refer to your repository of everyone's documents so everyone can access the information you need. Those are just some quick tips. I know this has been really long, but it's recorded so that you can refer back to it whenever you need and ask any questions. But I will leave you with this. You got this. Case competitions, honestly, are really, really fun. I know I've shared a lot of perhaps new content for you and new information, but use it as a resource, use it as a tool, use it as a way to help you. Take what helps you. If something doesn't help you, throw it away. Don't worry about it. But you can do this. Remember, case competitions are a really low risk thing. They're not a class and they're not your job. So it's a great way to practice things that you haven't done before. So then when you are in that job interview or you are in that tough class, you can say, oh, I've already done this before. Now, if this all sounds like fun to you, then you should engage with us at the Goff Strategic Leadership Center, because this is what we do. Pretty much everything we do is a real world engagement, not just case competitions. We have what's called the Goff Strategic Leadership Club. So if you want to interact with them, they're likely to have workshops and projects. If you're at the University of Utah, you can go on Campus Connect and search for Goff Strategic Leadership Club and join that club. If you want a more extensive experience, we also have a couple of undergraduate courses. One is called Goff Trailblazers and one is called Goff Scholars. Right now, those are Strat 5850 classes. Goff Trailblazers is 1 semester, Goff Scholars is 2 semesters. You can go to the website here, goffstrategicleadershipcenter.com, to learn a bit more. But in those classes, we do real world experiences like this. But instead of a case competition that's maybe a few weeks long, you might have a project that's a few weeks long, a semester long, or even a few months long. And again, working with a real company or organization to solve a problem. But in those classes, it's a little bit more structured and formalized, where you have a faculty member, you may have an advisor or coach, you have class time, you have all kinds of infrastructure to help you through those. But if this is something that you think sounds really fun, contact us, engage with us over social media, email, we're here for you. Thank you so much for your time today and for considering doing a case competition. I hope you have a ton of fun with it. They are great.